Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Pat Jenny, president of the Salisbury Forum. It has been 1 year since the Forum has presented one of its programs on a Zoom webinar rather than live, and we're very happy that so many of you have registered and joined us for what we hope will be a very informative and interesting evening. The Salisbury Forum presents a wide mix of topics in 8 or 9 programs over the course of a year, all free to the public. Most of these are live at our partner schools, as well as a film screening at the Millertown Movie House. Our experience during the pandemic, however, has proved that we can engage an audience well on Zoom webinars, and this is particularly useful for speakers who cannot travel to the area. And we always post a video within a week of each of our programs on our website so that you can watch at your convenience. And speaking of our website, salisburyforum.org, we invite you to take a look at our redesigned version if you haven't already. It's been streamlined, it's more attractive, or at least we think so, and it's far easier to negotiate and find the information that you need. Because our programs are free, we count on your support. We're very grateful for all of those who responded to our appeal letter at the end of last year. Your dollars, along with those of our institutional and business donors, allow us to present this robust schedule of speakers, panels, and films. So thank you. We're planning 1 or 2 exciting forums this spring, so watch our website for more information. And make sure that we have your email address, which you can provide on our website, so that we can receive notices of our programs in your inbox. This evening, we are delighted to welcome Carol Browner, currently senior counsel at the law firm Covington and Burling in Washington, D.C. Carol has had a long and illustrious career, both in and out of government, serving 2 presidents, 1 governor, and 2 senators. The seeds of Carol's career in environmental protection were sown when she was a child growing up in Miami and riding her bike to the Everglades, an area that she helped restore later on during her time in Florida state government. Carol earned her undergraduate and law degrees at the University of Florida. She served under Governor Lawton Chiles as Secretary of Florida's Department of Environmental Regulation for 2 years, where she met and worked with Vivian Garfein, who will interview her this evening. More on Vivian in a minute. In late 1992, President Clinton named Browner the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, a job that she kept for all 8 years of the Clinton administration, which is a record for EPA administrators. After co-founding the Albright Group with former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Carol became President Obama's director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy, affectionately known as the Climate Czar or Czarina. Since leaving that office in 2011, Carol has remained a staunch climate and environmental advocate in business and on a number of nonprofit and for-profit boards. Carol's career illustrates how both the power of the private sector and the markets and the regulatory and legal heft of government are both required to meet our environmental and climate goals. Vivian Garfein, who will interview Carol Browner, served as the Assistant General Counsel, the Bureau Chief of Surface Water Quality Management, and Central District Director at the Florida Department of Environmental Protection over 25 years. Now retired, she resides here in Salisbury and volunteers her expertise and time as a member of the town's Inland Wetlands and Watercourses Commission. Most importantly for us, Vivian is a former board member of the Salisbury Forum. After Carol's and Vivian's conversations, we will have time for Q&A with you. So please use the chat box, the chat button on the bottom of your screen in the middle at any time during the program to post your questions, and then we will pose them to the speakers. So now, please welcome Carol Browner and Vivian Garfein.
Thank you, Pat. Hi, Carol. I'm really delighted that you're with us this evening. I'm anxious for everyone to hear all the things you've done and your thoughts on government regulation, which is sort of what this is about. So let's get started. As Pat said, you've had a career in public service that has spanned 4 decades, and you're still going strong. I think I might have met you in the end of the first decade. I'm not sure. But tell us, how did this all get started? Did you have a career plan? Did you know where you were going?
Well, first, let me just thank you all for the invitation and to be a part of this great forum. And thank you for all the work you all do to keep people engaged and educated. It's just a real pleasure and an honor to be here and to be with Vivian, who, as she said, we knew each other a very, very long time ago. And if you think I keep going, you keep going. Vivian texted me or emailed me the other night about frogs. About the peepers that live in the little tiny ponds. And I spend most of my time now, although from Florida, most of my time in Vermont, where the peepers are a great indication that spring has finally come. They keep you awake for the night, but it's lovely. So no, I did not have a career plan at all. I'm frequently asked that by young people, what was your plan? How did you get to work for presidents and senators and things like that? I would say if I had a plan, it was to do things I was passionate about, to do things that I loved. And growing up in Miami, growing up on what would have been sort of the edge of the real Everglades, not Everglades National Park, but Everglades would have been all of South Florida at one point. I think it really instilled with me a sense of a special place, a place that I found that was really rewarding to visit, to enjoy the serenity of the Everglades, as I used to sometimes refer to the mountains of the Everglades, which are the storm clouds that roll in on an afternoon, on a rainy afternoon in Miami. But that for me was something that was so rewarding that when I got presented the opportunity, when I went out of law school to work for the Florida legislature, to work on environmental protection, it just all seemed to make sense. And I was sort of off and running.
Tell us about those legislative days. I didn't know about those.
They were a very long time ago. I was a young lawyer and I was working on the committee that had jurisdiction over land acquisition in Florida. And this was a program that was run out of the Department of Natural Resources. And unfortunately, there had been a lot of scandal. This was, I think, not uncommon for state land acquisition programs at one point. The person running the program was buying land from his friend, not from land that necessarily had the best environmental benefits. And so people ended up going to jail, but I got given the task of rewriting the law and making it much more focused on environmental protection, a much more competitive process. And it was great for the state of Florida. We really sort of changed what we were buying and really started to think about the ecological benefits of what we were buying and think about how things could be put together and create bigger greenways. And it was, it's more on the conservation side than what I do today, but in some ways it was also not just about land, it was about water, because water is so important to Florida. And now as I deal with climate change, I feel like I'm going to come full circle and I'm going to be back working on water.
Were there any particular, other than that, stories, other stories from those days, or any memories or stories that you're particularly proud of? I mean, that work was extremely important. I sort of was coming to Florida in those days.
Well, I think we all have probably both special places that instill in us a passion for our work. There are also special people, and I was very, very honored. And I know I don't know how many people are on the call from Florida, probably not many, but we had a very, just a wonderful governor way back when I was a young law student named Leroy Collins. And by the time I got to be working in the legislature. He was retired, but he took this real interest in rewriting this law. And so he would come by my office virtually every morning at 7 or 7:30 and just help me think about what it is we were doing. And to see a public servant, and he was a true public servant, had served in many ways in Florida and ultimately as governor, who was still committed to public service. He was a great man and really taught me a lot about public service.
He was a gem. I was in Florida in those days, and I recall him and the family, and yeah, really a gem. So how did it come about that you became the department's secretary, the secretary of the department?
Well, I moved to Washington, D.C. I ended my career in the legislature and I moved to Washington, D.C. and I worked with nonprofits, and then decided that I wanted to be back involved on the policy side, less at the advocacy side. And so I joined our then senator from Florida, Lawton Chiles, who ultimately went on to be governor. I joined him as his environmental advisor as a United States senator. And about, I don't know, maybe a week before I had a baby, he announced he was retiring from the Senate out of nowhere. So I had to go find myself another job. I had about a year, but I ended up being one of the first women legislative directors on Capitol Hill, working for Al Gore, running his legislative operation. And then politics being what it is, Lawton Chiles decided to come back into politics and ran for governor and called me and said, why don't you come down and run our environmental department? So back I went to Florida to run the environmental department.
Oh my gosh.
And, it's interesting because I got back to Florida and was immediately faced with a lawsuit. It had predated me, but basically the Department of Interior, who owns the national parks, was accusing the state of Florida of not doing its fair share in sort of protecting the national park because we weren't setting water quality standards. And so I took one look at this lawsuit and I thought, well, I want to protect the Everglades. It's like the place that drives me in my work, inspires me in my work. And so I went over and I saw Governor Chiles and I said, we have this lawsuit and I really think what we should do is settle it so we can get on with it rather than trying to fight it. We should enter into a settlement agreement. And he agreed with that. So we started a very long process of negotiating with the Justice Department, the Department of Interior, a lot of players in the room. And finally, we had reached an agreement. And so we had to go to court to present the agreement. And I went back over to see Governor Chiles and I said, well, I could have my general counsel, we had a lawyer, you would know him, Dan Thompson, come down and represent us in Miami where the litigation was filed in federal court. Or better yet, you could be my lawyer. And so Lawton Chiles and I got on an airplane and we flew to Miami and he went into federal court as my lawyer, as the department's lawyer, and said, I have come to lay down my sword. And we were up and running on trying to protect the Everglades, which has turned out to be something I've been involved in many times throughout my career. And, for those of you who visit Florida, perhaps you're familiar with the Everglades, but even if you're not, it is such a gem of a place and so essential to the health, not just the ecological health of the state, but the economic health of the state. We are a water dependent, tourism-based economy. And so protecting these marshlands that allow us to recharge our aquifers, which give us our drinking water. But it's also a highly maintained system and regulated system because tens of millions of people have chosen to move into this very fragile ecosystem. And so, I'm proud of what we did on the Everglades. I'm proud of what I did with President Clinton on the Everglades. But the truth of the matter is it is a job that will never be done.
This is very true. I was down there recently and there's still ongoing projects and ongoing growth. I do remember Dan Thompson very, very well because Dan was general counsel. I had left the department and I was coming back to the department. When I left the department, Dan said, you're not going to like what you're going to do and there'll always be a place for you here. And sure enough, I let him know after 2 years, is that place still available? And you were the secretary by then. And he said, yes, but you're going to have to pay penance. You're going to have to be the tanks attorney for a while. Do you remember that?
Yeah, that's tough.
So anyway, what other memories do you have of well, I remember also you had to deal with Hurricane Andrew.
We did. The Governor Chiles called me up about midnight, the night that Hurricane Andrew hit Miami and said, we're going to go down in the morning. Can you come with me? I said, certainly. And literally, as we flew down the east coast of Florida, we could see the storm off the west coast.
Mm.
And, I think as we were getting closer and closer to where the eye had hit, we made an assumption that, a lot of people were going to be dead. The truth of the matter is that didn't happen. We were very lucky
Yeah.
because we now know that this was more than a class 5 or a category 5 hurricane. It was a significant hurricane. Fortunately, it was further south, but we ended up I ended up not going home for several weeks, or only going home briefly, just trying to manage the response. We have a nuclear power plant in South Florida that was adjacent to a coal-fired power plant. The smokestack on the coal-fired power plant was cracked. It had to be imploded. It had to be taken down so it didn't fall on part of the nuclear plant. And the men who were in charge of taking it down put this tape and rope on the ground and said, okay, every brick is going to fall inside. And we're right, every brick fell right inside. But every day brought a new challenge. But the interesting thing about my Hurricane Andrew experience is that's where I met Bill Clinton. He came, it was the election, it was 1992, and Bill Clinton came down to visit the South Florida and the area that the hurricane had damaged, Florida City and Homestead. And in inevitable Bill Clinton fashion, which I didn't know before this, he was supposed to be there for 2 hours, and I think he was there for 6 hours. He sort of took it all on, and we walked the streets, and with Lawton Childs and other folks, and he was quite I think kind towards the people who were really suffering. It was a tough storm, as these storms are, and unfortunately, we're seeing more and more of them today. But if I think back about my career in Florida as the secretary, I would think, and you'll have some memories of this too. The work we did when Disney World came in and wanted to do their last major theme park, and they were going to build out Animal Kingdom, I think it was called, and Celebration, which was a sort of I don't even know, a planned community.
Prototype or something like that. Yeah.
People were going to live in it, like people could buy the houses. And they filed a permit with the state, and they wanted to destroy 400 acres of wetlands. And we took one look at it and we said, well, that's not going to happen. And so the then CEO of Disney Parks and I went out and we walked the land that I don't think he'd ever walked before. And as we're walking it, we saw wild turkeys, and we saw osprey, and I think he came to really appreciate it. And the end of the story is they did have to alter some wetlands. It was, I think, slightly more than maybe 100. But in exchange for that, we also wanted them to do a restoration project. And historically, what Florida and many other states were doing at the time is they'd get engineers to design them a wetland, and they'd go take what are called uplands, and they'd scrape them down, and they'd try and put water where nature had never put water, and they'd hoped it would function as an ecosystem, a wetlands ecosystem. And we said to them, and this is a testament to the Nature Conservancy in Florida at the time, is no, we don't want you to do that. What we think you should do is there's a ranch just south of your property called Walker Ranch. And at that point, Florida had as many head of cattle, or we was second to Texas in head of cattle. And what we want you to do is we want you to buy that ranch. And it is a heavily altered ecosystem. And we want you to restore it so it will function as the headwaters of the South Florida watershed. And they did that. And so it became a whole new way of thinking about when you have to alter a wetland or impact a wetland, don't have engineers build you a new one. Go find one that's been previously maybe, in some ways altered, and restore it. And nature will really, nature will take kindly to that, and that will become a really functioning part of an ecosystem. And it was historic what we did.
And it's a fabulous mitigation project. Oh my goodness. Yeah. So you bring me to the one of the times I remember chatting with you when I was one of your attorneys, and that was when you came back from Washington, D.C., and you had just had your interview with Bill Clinton, and I'm thinking, we're gonna lose her. We're gonna lose her. So let's segue to and through that time and into EPA and some stories about EPA and how all that was.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. So I interviewed for the EPA job in Little Rock with the president-elect on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. And this is 1992. And, my mother was coming to Tallahassee, and going from Little Rock to Tallahassee was no small thing, but I finally got myself home and was finally going to take a break and was relaxing for the weekend. And, this is back when cell phones were about as big as the shoebox. So I had a shoebox cell phone, and it starts ringing. And my mother had never really seen one of these. And she's like, "Why aren't you answering?" I'm like, "I don't want to answer it. It's Sunday. I'm not going to answer it." And she just harassed me and harassed me. So finally I said, "Fine, I'll answer it." So I answered it, and it was Bill Clinton's office calling. The head of his transition was Warren Christopher. And he said, "The president really enjoyed his time with you. So we'd like to advance you in the process," which means you go through this very elaborate called vetting process, where they look at everything about you. Since I had been a public servant, there wasn't very much to look at about me. But maybe about 10 days later, I got a phone call saying, "President-elect would like to talk to you later this afternoon." And I said, "Fine." And the call didn't come. And then finally his secretary called, and she said, "Do you think you can be in Little Rock tomorrow?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I can get there. Let me, figure this out." And so I called my then husband and I said, "I guess I'm going back to Little Rock. I'm not sure what it's about." He was very smart. He said, "Call them back and ask if you should get a new dress." I called back the secretary. I said, "Do you think I need a new dress?" She said, "Yeah, you need a new dress and you need to bring your family." So that's how I found out I was about to be the head of EPA. Eventually the president-elect did call me, but I was like, it was a funny moment to find out your future that way. And 8 years is a long time, but it was a great time. And had to go through a Senate confirmation hearing where I was voted out of the Senate 98-0. It was, a very different time than we have today in the United States Senate. The chair of the committee was a moderate Republican, John Chapey. He'd been Secretary of the Navy. His son went on to also be a senator, but he was a senator. And he said to me at the end of my confirmation hearing, which lasted so long, my 4-year-old son fell asleep behind me. He was clearly bored. And the senator said to me at the end, "Well, Miss Browner, I hope I never hear you say the word balance, because your job is not to balance. Your job is to protect."
Very interesting.
Very different times now.
Yeah. So tell us some more about some of the things that you did, the things that you're most proud of, or memories that you have. 8 years, goodness, a lot had to go on. You lived through the Newt Gingrich experience, and come on.
Yeah. So, Gingrich, EPA is sort of on the firing line when I get there. There's a lot of objections to the fact that Superfund sites aren't being cleaned up, that companies are being held responsible for the cost, but there are a lot of cost overruns. And, there's a whole series of things, but, sort of the anti-regulatory movement was just nascent, was just beginning. And 2 years later, Gingrich is elected, and they have EPA in their crosshairs, and we are shut down 3 times. We can't pay our employees. There's 16 different limitations on my authority that they attempt to pass. They do pass the first time. We're able to block it the second time. But what happens in this, back and forth with Gingrich and sort of the contract with America, is it gives us an opportunity at EPA, and eventually the president joins me and the vice president joins me, but it gives us an opportunity to really help the American people understand what EPA does, which is we're the environmental cop on the beat. We're the reason you have clean air, you have clean water, or cleaner air and cleaner water. And so we emerged from it actually much stronger than when we started. And so I sometimes people ask, your dark day, your best day. In some ways that was it. That was my darkest day, but out of it came my best time, because we were able to establish the first ever fine particle standards that had never been done before for air pollution. We argued it all the way to the Supreme Court. We won 9-0 in the Supreme Court. We would not win today. But we did win 9-0. We created a new program for drinking water. We enhanced all of the water programs. 110 Superfund sites had been cleaned up in like 14 years. We cleaned up 608 years. So we really figured out how to make the agency start working for the American people. And I'm proud. It's 15,000 people. It was a $5 billion budget when I was there. I'm really proud of the people who make up that agency, the public servants who make up the agency. and the work we did and the success we had in really honoring, the sort of what the American people expected of us, which is to protect those things we all share, our air, our water, not just to protect the beautiful places we like to go on our vacations, the national parks. Those are important, but we were all about protecting where you live and how you live your life.
I'm going to come back with an EPA question or two later on, but yeah, those were amazing accomplishments.
I set a lot of records in those years. I once testified for 9 hours straight. We had, eventually they stopped inviting me to testify because they realized I was getting better coverage on C-SPAN than they were. I had more congressional hearings than appearances before congressional committees than I think anybody in the Clinton cabinet had. I was the first EPA administrator to sit at the cabinet table. So, it was a great time, and I'm just so honored to have been selected to do that and to have served.
It was quite a time, but those days did end.
Yes.
They did end. And then after that, we heard about Madeleine Albright, the Albright Group. And what were you doing there? What was that all about?
When you're in the cabinet, there's like 15 or 16 of you, and there's a protocol order that you have to line up. So, for example, at the State of the Union, the newest member of the cabinet, meaning the newest department, the newest agency, goes first, second, third, all the way till you get to Secretary of State, who's in the line of succession. So Madeleine and I, there was always this confusion when she was UN ambassador. Was she 14 and I was 15, or was she 15 and I was 14? And so one day, and it was just uncomfortable every time, and we were sort of becoming friends at the end of the line. And one day I said to her, you know what, you'll just be 14 from now on and I'll be 15. And we'll just solve this here and now. So I took the last place, and it made us fast friends. And then I used to joke, she got a first class upgrade. She went to the front of the line, Secretary of State. I stayed at the back. And then the next person who showed up to replace her thought they should get 14. I'm like, no, you can have 15. I'm moving over to 14 now. But we became fast friends. And when we were both leaving government, we started thinking about what did we want to do? And we realized that we understood how governments all over the world made decisions, and that we could help companies who were looking to solve really significant public policy issues work with governments around the world. And so our first client, we built a very small boutique, but very successful business. Our first client was Merck Pharmaceuticals, which had one of the first antiretroviral drugs for HIV/AIDS patients. And we worked with the government of Botswana to reach a pricing agreement so that the drug could be sold to the government in a cost-effective manner. Now, Merck had histories of doing this. They had done with Jimmy Carter, actually, the Mectizin drug, which is for river blindness. It doesn't have a human application in the US, it has a veterinary application. But sort of working with companies to try and address really sort of long-standing public policy issues where you need to engage with the government. We did a project also with Merck, who makes Fosamax, which is a bone density drug. And in a lot of European countries, you have to get a pricing agreement before you can sell the drug. And it's a long queue. And so we worked with Merck to do a study on if you prevented broken bones in women, what that would mean for the local economy, for that country's economy. And so rather than going to the health minister, because it's true all over the world, finance ministers are more powerful than health ministers or environmental ministers. So we went to the finance minister and he said, look, we can help your government save money. And so we got to the front of the line and got a pricing agreement, and women got the Fosamax. And so those were the kind of things we thought about. But she was a dear friend. Last week was the anniversary of her passing, and I still think about her every day.
She was quite something. And as a former Fosamax taker, this was quite interesting to me. So that's really something. So those days ended, or sort of phased out?
No, I think what probably happened is I met Barack Obama. I met when he was a senator, and we stayed friendly. And then when he became president, he called and he said, can you come to the White House? It's unusual for people who run large departments or agencies to come into a second administration and come into the White House. They're two very different sort of undertakings. And I said, look, I'll do it for a year. I'll help you get the programs up and running. I ended up doing for 2 years and a bit. There was a BP oil spill, some things happened that I needed to help him navigate. But, at the moment, what we were able to do was the largest financial investment in clean energy in the history of the United States. What Biden just did has way surpassed it, and I'm obviously very happy about that. But, there were some issues involving the wind and solar, the nascent wind and solar industry. There were some tax credit issues. We were able to solve that and really help save that industry. We did a lot of work with the car companies that really gave birth to the huge investments in electric vehicles. I think Obama has a lot to be proud of in terms of his sort of climate record. Complication is that Trump undid some of it, and then, Biden has come back. And so I think next week or in the next couple of weeks, we'll see building on what Obama did to regulate cars and trucks in terms of fuel efficiency, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the Biden administration now sort of picking up because Trump undid a lot of that. The nice thing is the companies have stepped up without the government regulation. But, government regulation, the title tonight, I think, was about government regulation. Why do you need it? And, what government regulation does in the environmental space is it sort of sets a floor. And you want to obviously figure out ways to reward companies that go even further, and there are mechanisms in dealing with car pollution to do that. And they've been important to companies like Tesla that's allowed them to monetize the fact that they make a clean car by selling credits to companies who aren't yet making clean cars to offset the emissions. But I think that, the way you could sort of work everybody together to think about these issues was a real sort of a first in time in Obama, because we took authorities that sat in 3 different departments and wove them together to create the Cleaner Car Program for the United States.
Well, I just want you to know that as of last week, my Mike bought an electric car, all electric.
Yes, I have one too, all electric.
All electric. Won't go that far. And we have the charger in the garage.
Well, okay, for those of you who are hesitating about buying your electric car, I own an all electric. That's the only car my husband and I own, and we drive it to Vermont and back once a month. So you can go far. You just have to stop and charge, which turns out to not be so bad.
I will tell Mike that. I'm the one that's been a little nervous about it, but I call it his little green machine.
No reason. So, well, what's your favorite thing you did while you were in Florida? Thinking about the
gosh, Carol, you warned me. I did think about that, and I had a lot of different experiences, but I think the best part and the best times for me was when I was the district director in Central Florida, which was a large district, as you know, and it was a large department. We had a staff there of 150 people, scientists and engineers and staff. And we covered an area of 8 counties, some of the busiest counties. Disney was one of the, yeah. But the challenge and what I loved there was we were boots on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
We were implementing the rules that the Environmental Regulation Commission and others were promulgating. So it was, again, not necessarily working compromise, but working out ways to get things done, to have the public or the industry understand what was important about the regulation and get buy-in and more than that. Those were very exciting days, and to have the staff get excited and have them involved in a very, very responsible, and I can't say enough about that staff in those days. It's a different agency now, of course, but that overall, those were just days where there were just wonderful things that happened, and wonderful things that we could accomplish there, and with the interface with the public. And
yeah, I think there's something about working at the state level that can be very tangible. We did a lot of work in terms of buying the last undeveloped beachfronts and putting them into public ownership and, perpetual protection. It's tangible at EPA, but in, clearly cleaner air, cleaner cars is tangible, but it's not the same as getting to walk along a beach that you were part of helping to preserve.
Yeah, or talking to to neighbors who have done something with their wetlands and explaining to them why they need to restore that wetland and what they can do about it, and teach them what we need to get done, and then follow up. It's a whole different thing on a very different level, but very satisfying. And that's where I finished out my career, and it was quite something. You started to talk about Biden.
Mhm.
President Biden, and it is true that he is accomplishing a great deal. And I'd like for you to talk more about that, what's coming down the pike, what he's trying to accomplish, and also as part of that discussion, I said I would bring EPA back up, because what I'm reading is that EPA is stretched and stressed right now, trying to accomplish all of this, because there's been they're trying to catch up for the last 4 or 5 or 6 years. Okay. So I'd like for you to talk about that and how you think that might come out. And it seems as though, as we've talked before and now, that what you've described and what I think you called it is the arc of environmental regulation. And I'd like for you to elaborate on that and talk some more about what's happening now and the challenges now, and why regulation is so important and what needs to be accomplished.
Yeah, so I think when we think about environmental regulation, we actually think, if you think about go back to the early 1900s, and really the first environmental conservation is really all about conservation. The first big movement are wealthy women in New York and in the cities deciding that they wouldn't put the feathers in their hats anymore, because they were decimating particular bird species. And there's a law passed, the Migratory Bird Act, and it's still a law today that is a very important law. And then we move forward, and you have Teddy Roosevelt, and you have the creation of the National Park Service. And then you have Richard Nixon creating EPA as we start to confront the realities of our industrial life and the pollution that comes with it. And the system we use is a regulatory system. The agency looks at the science, they look at the law. They're not free to do just anything. They're bound by the science and the law. A standard is set, permits are issued, and the companies that are emitting the pollution are held to account. And that's really been the system that has brought us so much progress. I think in what we are experiencing right now in terms of what Biden just did, which is a $450 billion investment in clean energy, is rather than using the sticks that we have historically used, the regulatory scheme to really push the biggest advances, we're going to use money. We're going to use tax credits. It's carrots. And it's a really interesting question. Will you get further with carrots than we got with sticks? We made a lot of progress with sticks. Now, you can't let go of the sticks, because again, you need to ensure you have that regulatory floor, because not everyone will, be as responsible as the leaders. But there are lots of reports out there. Goldman Sachs has a report out today that 480 fully leveraged could be 1.2 trillion invested in clean energy and green companies. And so I'm very hopeful. It is a major undertaking for this administration. We just did for our clients, we did a PowerPoint on the various tax credits that exist and the various tax provisions that exist. And we thought it would be, maybe 20 pages. It's 70 pages long.
Oh my goodness.
Because that's how much is in there, not because we wanted it to be 70 pages, we didn't. But and it's not just the tax credit you can get for buying a electric car. It's the tax credit my son and his wife can get for completely rewiring their house and going to all electricity for their heating, for their cooling, for their cooking. And there's just a whole bevy of these things. And as I said, I am optimistic. It is not a insignificant undertaking. And EPA was decimated by the Trump years. A lot of people left. They've been given new hiring authority. They're hiring quickly. They have responsibility for some of these programs. They need to get the right people in place to up and move the programs out to make sure the money is being used. And at the same time, we're seeing a backlash. sometimes referred to as an anti-ESG backlash. Now, some of you, probably many of you are going to say, what is ESG? And ESG is really what the private sector, the public companies have sort of been committing to, which environmental, social, and governance standards. And so what is their commitment in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, their climate impact? What are their social principles in terms of slavery in their supply chain, human labor in their supply chain? What are their governance commitments, diversity and inclusion? And, companies all over the world and here in the United States have made very significant commitments, and some are now challenging those commitments, saying, for example, that if you are a company and you take into account how climate change may affect your supply chain, that is not a fiduciary responsibility. That is simply woke capitalism. That is simply you trying to have a public policy as opposed to run your company. I violently disagree with this. I think any company that is not considering what their climate risks are and I serve on a public company board, and we spend a lot of time on this, is not, but companies not doing it are not really being responsible fiduciaries to their shareholders. We do expect the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to maybe next month, maybe the month after, require all public companies to start making climate risk disclosures, because they also believe it is a fiduciary responsibility. But at the same time, this pushing back by some who think this is simply, companies, whether it's, you can read all the different names in the newspaper, embracing, public policies that are not in the best interest of shareholders. It's an interesting little debate that's going on.
Oh, my goodness. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
Well, so where are we today? And more, where are we going with the climate change? This is something that you're now very, very much involved with, and with with your firm and with the company that you're on the board on.
Yeah, so we're making progress. We're slow. We're very slow. And the scientists are telling us we're too slow. And so, 10 years ago, when I would speak about climate change, I've been speaking about it for a long time. I would always talk about what we call mitigation, which is how are you going to reduce the greenhouse gases? How are you going to reduce that pollution as the thing that we needed to focus on? And people would occasionally ask me, well, what about how do we adapt to the reality of climate change? And I'd be like, nope, I'm not going to talk about that, because I still believe we can mitigate the pollution. Today, I talk about mitigation. Sometimes I talk about adaptation and resiliency as much as I talk about mitigation, because the reality is we are already starting to live with the consequences of climate change, and we are going to have to adapt to that. And so when I say resiliency and adaptation, it's really opposite sides of the same coin. Adaptation is the reality that they're going to come. How do you adapt? Maybe you restore some wetlands so they take the storm surge. Resiliency is when you're whacked by a storm, how quickly can you get back up and going? And the better you've adapted to the reality of increasing storms, the more resilient you are. And the perfect example is when Sandy hits, lower Manhattan, right? It takes out the Con Edison line. Right. And so you have that whole part of the economy. It's billions of dollars that are impacted in New York goes down. And so then the city was faced with the very difficult question of what do you do? Because we know more storms are going to come. And they did run some projects in an effort to restore some of the wetlands, to take some of the storm surge. They offered people lots of money. It turned out not to be very successful, not because people didn't try, but people didn't want to move. And that's what happens. Then there was the question, what do you do with the Con Edison line? Well, you could raise it, you could encapsulate it in material that's completely waterproof, but that's very expensive. And so these are the kind of issues we're going to have to start to deal with, right? As more and more storms come, just the reality of these dramatic weather events that we're now experiencing. The flooding that we're experiencing in Miami, as you probably know, we have something called dry weather flooding. It is not raining and it is flooding in certain parts of the city. And so, I think that as excited as I am about what Biden has done and the investments he's making and the opportunities, I continue to be worried that we're really not going fast enough.
Do local governments have an issue with that? I'm thinking about a small local government in Northeast, in the district. And they needed to do some just they needed to do some changes, make some changes. And they started moving things to the west of I-95. And this is years ago. And I thought, how prescient, how forward-thinking this town council was in saying, we're not going to do that much beach nourishment anymore. We're going to start to move people. Yep. And instead of, reconstructing this downtown area that needs to be refurbished, let's start moving away from the coast. So,
the interesting thing about about nature, it will do a lot to protect itself, given the opportunity. And we've interfered repeatedly in that opportunity. I don't know if any of folks in the audience have ever read, there's a great writer, John McPhee, who writes about the environment. He has this great essay about the taming of the Mississippi, and the Army Corps of Engineers comes in, and every year they're going to straighten it and they're going to stop it from flooding, and they build the walls higher and higher and higher, and they lose basically over and over and over again. And that's a story you could tell about a million places in the United States and around the world. And so, just giving nature a little bit of space, so you allow the floodwaters to seep into the marshes and be controlled there. You keep the sand dunes in place. There was a lot of flooding in the Mississippi and the Missouri when I was at EPA, and so we would help rebuild drinking water systems. And we looked at one, and we're like, why are you building this in the floodplain? We're like, well, that's where it's been. We're like, you need to get out of the floodplain. And so starting to rethink all of these policies, because we do have federal money that kicks in after storms, and some of the policies were smart at the time, but they don't account for climate change. And so, you couldn't move to a new location. We're like, well, that's crazy. You have to move to a new location. And so, starting to think about, but I think, I am optimistic that we have really amazing companies and leaders thinking about the climate solutions, thinking about the technologies. I meet almost 2 or 3 times a week with a young company that has a very, very smart technology. And, the hope is that they can all make it, or that some huge number of them make it, because we are now in a situation where we need to let nature do its part, but we also need a lot of technological solutions, and some will be quite controversial. And at the same time, as we're thinking about this transition, this amazing, massive transition in how we make energy in this country, how we just transmit it, how we distribute it, we need to think about those communities that have been most impacted by our modern industrial life, frequently communities of color, poor communities, and that this transition is a just and equitable transition, that it doesn't continue to leave the coal worker behind, it doesn't continue to leave the poor community that suffers the disproportionate pollution burden, and those are complicated and hard conversations to have.
And that we don't burden a new community while trying to repair another one. So all of this.
It's all very complicated.
Yeah, it really is.
It seems like we have a lot of questions.
We do. I'm seeing that the chat room is filling up. So yes. I was about to say, let's bring Pat back in and see what kinds of questions we're getting, and see if we can answer some of those. I think Pat will bring us the questions. Hi, Pat.
Okay.
Nope, we can't hear you, Pat.
Sorry.
I did it too.
Thank you both very much. This has really been a very interesting conversation between 2 colleagues and friends. Yes, we do have a number of questions that have already been posted. And let me start with Richard Wolkowitz's question. What action would you recommend to a private citizen concerned about climate change to have the greatest impact? Is it political action, involvement in a nonprofit?
Vote. There's one answer: vote. Take the time to become an informed citizen and participate in our democratic process. And obviously, I'm a Democrat. I've only worked for Democrats, but I'm not advocating that you only vote for Democrats. Vote for candidates that you think take seriously the issue of climate change and what we need to do. One of my what I call this, my labors of love, is I chair one of the large environmental group nonprofit boards. We, the League of Conservation Voters, LCV, and we're the folks who really engage with the electorate around elections. And we have a very proud history of being bipartisan. We've supported lots of Republicans over the years. We do have a threshold question today, which is, do you believe climate change is real? And are you prepared to vote for climate policies? We don't list out the policy we think you should vote for, but are you prepared? And right now we do not have basically any Republicans in the United States Senate who will take that pledge. And that is very disappointing, because we did have people like John Chapey. You know, we had really amazing Republican leaders. And, you know, think what you may about Richard Nixon. He did start EPA.
Started
It was a
EPA.
Republican that started EPA.
Right. No, and that divide is hurting so many issues, but obviously in particular, climate change and climate issues. On that note, do you think that this is from Kent Haichu? Do you think it's possible for Congress to be able to enact effective legislation in this kind of environment? Obviously, you've talked about the Inflation Reduction Act and all of the programs that are in that. That was a major accomplishment. But just given what's going on, both with the Supreme Court and Supreme Court decisions, do you foresee in some near-term future additional legislation that would give the federal government a major role in this meeting climate goals?
I would hope so, but I think it's highly unlikely now that we have a Republican-led House. You know, I think there continue to be members of the Senate who are open to conversations, but I do not think the current House will pass any significant environmental or climate change legislation. And in fact, I think they will try and undo parts of the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of some of the funding for clean energy. You mentioned the Supreme Court, and I do think this is another important piece of the puzzle. There's so much more litigation today around these issues. And I mentioned that when I was running EPA, I think maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 of my decisions ultimately made it to the Supreme Court, and we basically prevailed. And on a very important one, which was, I said, the first ever fine particle air pollution standard. These are little tiny microscopic particles that lead to premature death and asthma and other things. And we won 9-0 with Antonin Scalia writing the majority opinion. And the argument had been that I had set a standard that was unconstitutional, that Congress should never have given me the power to set air pollution standards, that it was a inappropriate delegation of congressional authority to a regulatory agency. And we argued it was not, it's sometimes referred to as a non-delegation doctrine. This is important because it's coming back up. It sort of disappeared. It came up during FDR, then it came up in this particular case. And we argued that no, Congress had been very clear in its instructions to me. It said, or to the EPA administrator, set a public health standard based on the best available science with a margin of safety. And so I had to check each of those boxes. And Scalia said in the majority opinion, it was all 9, that I had done that Congress should change the law, that it was a bad law, and that the standards shouldn't be set in that manner. They should be set basically on a cost-benefit analysis. How much would it cost industry to reduce their pollution, and what would be the benefit? So the lives saved, the asthma attacks avoided. And we had done a cost-benefit analysis. We had looked at the economic impacts of these regulations and had made that public, but we then said we did not make our decision based on this because that's not what the law said. The law said, public health, margin of safety, best science. And I think that this idea that we should always look at what are the costs to industry and the benefits to society of setting pollution standards is very short-sighted. And the reason being, we did a 20-year retrospective of regulations at EPA, and we looked at what it had been projected to cost industry to comply, and then what it actually cost. And EPA, the industry and EPA were wrong in every single instance, because what happens is once you set that regulation, you create a market demand. And so American ingenuity and innovation rises to the occasion. There's a competition to provide that widget, to provide that scrubber. And that drives inevitably down the cost of compliance. And the other thing we found is that the benefits far exceeded what we had originally anticipated. And so this idea that rather than basing it on science, that there's a moral and ethical obligation, that it should be this economic analysis, I think is, unfortunately, very narrow. Last year's Supreme Court issued an opinion called West Virginia versus EPA. And what EPA sought to do in regulating power plants that burn fossil fuels and emit pollutants and greenhouse gases is say, we need to achieve the following reductions, and legally we can require you to achieve them, but we're going to give you flexibility, individual power plant, to find the cheapest way to get there. And that might mean you go out and you help all of the people who buy your power buy cleaner appliances, that you look far and wide for the cheapest solution to meeting the standard. And basically what the Supreme Court said is, no, you can't do that. You need to get inside the fence line, and you can only set a standard based on what can be done inside the fence line. And so EPA is now back at the drawing board trying to make a series of standards for power plants and clean air. The concern about that decision is, one, you don't get the most reasonable answer, but two, that embedded in the opinions that were issued is this idea, again, of the non-delegation doctrine, or sometimes referred to as the major questions doctrine, which is some questions are so big, they should always go back to Congress. And that will be a very hard way to govern if every question has to go back to Congress. Although I have this, a few times industry has gone to Congress over the history of EPA and gotten them to actually set the standard in a law, as opposed to letting EPA do it based on science, based on notice and comment rulemaking, based on technology. And what happens is when Congress is faced with that choice, they've inevitably set a greener number than EPA would have set, because they don't want to be the people who let pollution out. So I say to some of my industry friends sometimes, I'm like, are you sure that's what you want? Because history would suggest that's not a good decision. But I think the courts have become a much more significant player. There's a doctrine called the Chevron doctrine, which is actually named after the oil company. It's a case involving EPA from many years ago, but it affects all regulatory agencies, which is, the court said, if there's ambiguity in a statute, there is, trust me, always ambiguity, then the agency, if they make a rational interpretation, should be given deference. And that is allowed. The Clean Water Act, which is what helps us have clean, safe water, has not been reauthorized since the 50s or the 60s. And so if EPA wasn't able to make these kind of Chevron decisions, we would have ground to a halt in cleaning up our rivers, lakes, and streams. And so I think it's really important when you think about environmental protection in this country, when you think about less asthma in our children, less greenhouse gases, to think about that the courts are increasingly playing a very real and significant role.
Right. So on the topic of regulations, Mary Oppenheimer asks, are there regulations that could help us address rising oceans, the rising level of oceans, and increased number of storms? Is that something you could address in a regulatory framework?
Yeah, you have to reduce your reliance on fossil fuels. It is the burning of fossil fuels that is changing the climate. When you burn fossil fuels, you're releasing greenhouse gases. That changes the climate, that brings the storms, that brings the sea level rise because the icebergs are melting. I mean, we're just in this vicious cycle of, putting too much pollution in the air. There are some greenhouse gases are more potent than others. You can get more bang for the buck if you reduce those. Some last longer in the environment, some are short-lived. So there are options within what we do. But when you think about the burning of greenhouse gases, where they come from making electricity, they come from the transportation sector, and they come from our buildings. And so, and then you can think about agriculture, you can think about other industries, but it's sort of broadly speaking, and we have to think about within each of those sectors, what can we do to drive down the emission level? So for example, an electric car, obviously, even a more efficient car can make a difference. You're burning less fossil fuels to go a particular distance. When we think about electricity, we can think there are so many smart appliances out there now. I just put in I'm going to forget a heat pump hot water heater because I wanted to use electricity to make hot water at my house in Vermont in the summer rather than burning home heating oil. And so I think all of us are going to be, you know, and we're not suggesting everybody run out and do it tomorrow, but as you replace appliances, you know, there are decisions you as a consumer can make and be a part of this.
I want to add to that for just a minute that there's a big movement on here in our little town for people getting heat pumps, and I was concerned about that because I had a Florida heat pump. They're making them now up here so that they'll work.
Right. It's a whole new technology. Yeah,
right, exactly. So there are a number of people who are getting heat pumps here in our little Salisbury, and our affordable housing group is looking at putting heat pumps in our new affordable housing development. So let me put in a affordable housing.
Very optimistic note, right? So Lee DeBoer on this topic has an interesting question. What can be done about the gridlock that the super regional authorities are experiencing relating to new alternative energy providers getting access to the power grid?
Okay, so there's two different issues sort of embedded in that, I think, Lee. One is the grid. When I was working for President Obama, he used to say, if Thomas Edison came back and took one look at the grid, he'd recognize it because nothing has changed. That's not too far from the truth. The grid is we spent a lot of time, I spent a lot of time when I was with Obama trying to sort through the grid issues. They're very complicated because they are part and parcel with siting issues. Like, where do you put all of these lines? Pipelines are a little bit different. I mean, I have concerns about pipelines, but they are buried. And so and also the authority that the federal government has to site pipelines is different than the authority that the federal government has to site large transmission lines. And so there's some issues in the law. The second issue is, so that is a real issue. And there's a lot of money in the IRA to try and address some of these grid and reliability issues. The second issue is how we regulate utilities. And so you have state public service commissions. I don't know what you guys might have a public utility commission. They have different histories. The laws vary all across the country. Sometimes they're appointed officials, sometimes they're elected officials. And then you have regional hubs that are sort of managing. When I was growing up, probably when many of you were growing up, I lived in Miami, as I said, and we got a bill from Florida Power. They made the electricity, they transmitted the electricity, and they distributed. That is very rare now. These sort of vertically integrated public utilities, more and more, there's someone who's generating it, putting it out to the grid. People are buying it, they're buying different things. It's a much more dynamic situation. But having said that, and some of that's good, and not all of it's good, that I think it's one of these things where the laws have not really kept pace with the times, and they certainly are not forward looking. And sort of how we manage all of this, I think the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, has a huge role to play. But here's politics for you. They don't have a chair right now, because they have an acting chair, but someone needs to be nominated, and it hasn't happened, and it has to be confirmed, and that'll be controversial. And so I think, unfortunately, Lee, that's still a hard one to address. And I want to just mention, since we're talking about the grid and we're talking about power, actually, this is from Madeline. All right, I guess it was about 15 or so years ago. We were writing a paper about very early, there were about 5 or 6 of us writing it together and thinking about climate change. And in the course of writing it, it occurred to me that my opposition to nuclear power was really not well-founded because of my concern about climate change. Nuclear power produces no greenhouse gases. And so I very publicly came out in support of nuclear power, in support of the existing nuclear power fleet. When I took this position, it was 25% of baseload in the United States. Today, it is 20. We are losing our existing nuclear fleet because nuclear power is more expensive to make. And when you put it out to the grid, if you're generating power from nuclear at a nuclear plant, you're competing with natural gas, you're competing with coal, you're competing with wind and solar. And so one of the things we have not done in the pricing of our energy production in this country is embedded the externalities, the cost of climate change, right? And so something that's causing all of us to have higher insurance rates, perhaps more asthma, greater storms, et cetera, that cost is not embedded in the cost of the actual energy, right? And so, I think it's, people have looked at ways to do this, carbon taxes, et cetera. Probably most of them are not politically viable, but fortunately in many states now, governors who are committed to addressing climate change have stepped in to try and make sure that their existing nuclear power fleet does not come offline, that they can manage it so that it is cost effective to keep those facilities. And there's an emerging technology, Gates and a couple other people are behind these small modular reactors, which are small little nuclear reactors. And the attractive thing about them is you could put them on an existing site. Like if you're closing down a coal-fired power plant, you'd be able to use that site and put a couple of them together. I think they're great. We're building a couple in the US to try and test them. Probably more important than what we do with them here in the US is what we will do, what the world could do with them. Because remember, we still have lots of people without electricity. And the most important step for modernity, for women, is electricity, right? If you want to create opportunities for women, you need to give them electricity so they have refrigeration, so they have medicines for their children. Their children don't die young. They're not constantly trying to replace the children. And we still have a lot of the world to electrify. And so we need to not only, we could do everything here. We could be perfect here. And if the rest of the world is still burning fossil fuels, we have a problem.
So you both, Vivian and you, touched on this briefly. We have a question from Christopher Sinclair. It's a couple of questions, actually. What are some common threads that you have observed within grassroots activist groups and movements in the climate change sphere that have distinguished themselves as being more successful or more effective than others? Let's start with that one.
Well, times have changed. What worked 20 years ago is very different than what works today. And clearly social media is a big factor in sort of how groups are able to organize. But what we know about voters, and this is true Democrat, Republican, that the single most valuable sort of piece of information you can get as a voter is hearing from somebody what they're thinking. If I call up my sister and say, I'm going to vote for so-and-so, that is very valuable to her. And so the more we engage people in our participatory democracy, the more people are, whether it's at your church, at your job. I mean, this is why unions, people always talk about the money in unions, but unions have been really successful because they're talking to each other. They're having conversations about how to participate in elections. And so there's a lot of work going on now among grassroots organizations around elections to understand how do we create these forums for conversations where people are hearing from the people they trust, who, what they're thinking about an election, how they're thinking of voting on a ballot initiative. So I'm the first to say, I do have a Facebook account. I've never used it. I have no clue what Instagram, TikTok, or a tweet is. So, but they're very effective, I am told.
Yeah, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively.
Sure.
And we do have quite a grassroots group here, Democracy Forward. That may not have the right name of it, but it's a very active group that meets fairly regularly as needed to talk about and to work to get people voting.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very active group.
I mean, I guess if I could change one thing tomorrow across the entire country, well, two things. I would have same-day voter registration. You show up, you get to vote. This is what we argue for all over the world, right? And then you kick out the votes that you didn't think were legit, which are not usually a lot. I would change the Electoral College. I would turn it to a popular.
Yeah.
From Anita Jorgensen, electric heating, cars and appliances removes, I believe, the source of the power. at the end of any power cord is the production of power, oil, gas, hydro, nuclear, etc. How can we shift away from the sources of power being largely based on burning fossil fuels? That is the 64th.
So, when you think about the hierarchy of using electricity, right, we all use it. The first thing you have to start with is efficiency, right? Are there ways to use less smart appliances, et cetera? Let's start with, we want to diminish fossil fuels. We want to diminish greenhouse gas emissions. So, as an individual, you think about efficiency, you think about the appliances, you think about heating, you think about driving. As a member of a society, you think about, where is that electricity coming from? And how can you work with your utility, with the who's ever selling you that electricity? I buy clean power. It doesn't mean I get a clean power electron, but it means that my provider has to buy that much more clean energy, because 10 of us signed up for clean energy. And then I think that as we are making progress in terms of wind and solar and price parity, is it competitive in the market? We continue to need to make that progress. Now, some people will complain about the tax credits that are available for wind production, for solar production. I would just remind people that we have underwritten in various ways the fossil fuel industry for, I don't know, 100 years. And, we have a long history of using our tax code to create and build industries. Why did we give oil companies all those breaks going back into the early 1900s, the 1920s? And some of them still exist today. We did it because we wanted to build the automotive industry. And so, we were making investments in ensuring that there would be fuel available. Today, we're making investments in electric batteries for cars. And, this idea that we shouldn't be doing these things and the market should control. I'm for the market doing its part, but the market has always been helped by public policy and by tax codes. And so, I appreciate the question. What we can do as a consumer, there's what we can do in our community, and there's then, what we should expect of our policymakers in Washington.
I don't see any other questions in the chat room. I thought that perhaps we could wrap this up somehow. If we could hear from either one of you about, where are you most optimistic in this plethora of activities going on right now to reduce greenhouse gases? Where do you think where are we going to get the biggest bang for the buck? Do you, whether it's in the regulatory framework or the carrots that are embedded now in the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, or in the private markets, the work that's going on in various industries to move off fossil fuels? Where would you think what would you identify as?
I'll have to speak locally, and then I'll let Carol speak globally, because locally I see more and more people here being very thoughtful about what they're doing, at least in the circles that I run with, in terms of buying electric cars or thinking about it where we did it, and appliances, and the heat pumps that really work well in this climate and need to, especially, again, we've got a number of projects that are in the works, not built yet, for affordable housing, and we're putting affordable appliances in there, and solar is being considered. More and more people are putting solar up around here. Even though we have a lot of trees, we couldn't do that. But so I say locally, I am seeing more and more people wanting to move in that direction. You have to start in your own backyard. So that's my part of this. Carol.
So you gave a list of, wind, solar, electric cars. It's an all hands on deck moment. Put it all on the table. Try it all. We're way behind. We are seriously behind. And we run the risk as a generation of leaving to our children a planet that is permanently altered. Nobody has done that before. They've left problems. I mean, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire and we had to clean it up. The pollution was so thick in Pittsburgh, you couldn't see from a building to a building. But we seriously run the risk of leaving a planet that is permanently altered. What gives me hope? Young people. They're amazing. They've got it. They believe it. They're out there. They're in the streets. Sometimes they're on TikTok. There was just President Biden made a decision, which I do not agree with, to open up a part of Alaska to drilling. There were hundreds of, depending on who you talk to, maybe as many as 100 million, what were they, TikTok posts about it. They care, and they're judging people on it. And they may not choose the kind of public service that Vivian and I chose. They may not, my husband served in Congress, they may not choose to run for office, but they're engaged, and we need them to be engaged, and we need them to be a part of this conversation and a part of this commitment. So when I say young people, I probably mean 40 years or younger. I'm not just talking about my 10-year-old grandson. I'm talking about my adult children. They're the people who give me hope. And all of you joining tonight give me hope. The idea that you would take time out of, we all have very busy lives, that you would take time out of your busy life to spend a few minutes thinking about, how do we address very complicated and important environmental issues. So thank you.
I have to thank you again, Carol, for taking time out of what I know is one of the busiest lives around to come and give us this wonderful, wonderful evening with you. And it's been a delight. And maybe next time we'll get you in person. That would be wonderful. But this worked well, and I thank you so much.
Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Well, thank you both. You as women have really modeled fabulous careers, both of you, and it is a real standard for which the generation that you were just talking about, Carol, really looks to your leadership. So thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening, and we'll see you next time.